So with that, let's begin our program. It's my pleasure to introduce Chris Schnepf. He's based out of Coeur d'Alene. Chris received his BS in Forestry and Environmental Studies from Iowa State University, and he has an MS in Forest and Range Management and an MA in Adult and Continuing Education, both of those from WSU, my alma mater. And Chris serves as the Continuing Education Coordinator for the Inland Empire section of the Society of American Foresters. So he is a bona fide forester. He has written many extension publications and articles for the popular press. He's produced some award-winning videos on selective timber harvesting and forest water quality, and he's received the Society of American Foresters National Award for Technology Transfer last year. So to ask any questions of Chris during the presentation, use the chat function. And Chris, I'll turn the time over to you. Welcome.
Thanks, Preston. Yeah, so I've given a number of talks to this group before, so most of you kind of know who I am and what I do. But for anybody that doesn't, you know, I work over the 4 northern counties for the University of Idaho, offering a variety of education programs for forest owners, professional foresters, and loggers, generally on forest ecology and silviculture and variants thereof. But I sometimes my colleagues describe me as a forestry specialist. I always have to remind them that I'm a forestry generalist. That you know, I have to dabble in economics and a bunch of other things we have specialized positions for on campus. But if you're not familiar with extension, most of this group probably is, but U of I has extension offices in 42 of Idaho's 44 counties, where they'll place anywhere from 1 to 4 faculty. Some positions are dedicated to specific counties, like Jennifer Jensen there in Sandpoint. Others of us have area appointments, so I cover the 4 northern counties for forestry and get pulled into stuff in other parts of the state as well. The talk I'm going to give today is we do an annual program with loggers in the spring called Leap Update, where they can get some continuing education credits. In the last 5-10 years, I've been picking a species and really doing a deep dive on it, at least relative to what most people's experiences are with them, on the ecology and silviculture of those species. Silviculture, if you're not familiar with that term, is basically the culture of forests, which is generally informed by an understanding of forest ecology, particularly in North America, where for the most part we're managing our forests to mimic how these forests grew and developed historically. Of course, people will debate the degree of fidelity with how things grew historically, and we can have a long discussion about that. But today the focus is on subalpine fir, and it's actually one of my favorite trees in North Idaho. My favorite still has to be white pine, with larch running in a close second. But subalpine fir is certainly a tree that I'm more intimate with in a sense, because we get a subalpine fir Christmas tree every year and have gotten them for family and friends, and I tend to really like the places where it tends to grow, which is along streams. I'm a fly fisherman, so you often find subalpine fir growing in long streams because they're typically a little colder there, and of course higher elevations in the high country. So I'm going to share my screen here, hopefully successfully, and get this. Let's see. Yet. Okay. So share screen. Okay, are you all seeing my screen okay?
Not yet, Chris.
Okay. How about now?
Yes.
Okay. let's go to screen view. Okay, how's that look?
That looks great.
Okay, great. So subalpine fir is a fairly wide-ranging species, and there's a lot of, this map comes from a Forest Service publication, USDA publication called Silvics of North American Trees, which is available online. Well, if you want to learn about, the seminal science on any of our basic tree species and stuff, that's a great resource to access. But like many of our tree species here, it grows quite a ways up into British Columbia as well, down through the inland Northwest. But if you look further down on the map, you guys can see my cursor here. If you look further down on the map, you'll see it grows high elevation areas all the way down in Arizona and New Mexico. They're fairly faint dots on this image, but fairly wide-ranging species. But that does tend to be found as a name in firs at higher elevations. Sometimes what people will call alpine fir. Technically, alpine is above timberline. So the reason the proper name for it is subalpine fir is the species that occurs just right at or just below timberline. But you also find it in frosty areas at lower elevations. If Priest River Basin, for example, has a lot of little pockets of subalpine fir growing here and there that aren't terribly high in elevation. It's the smallest of our western true fir species. Mature trees are maybe 45 to 100 feet tall, 12 to 24 inches in diameter. So not a really big true fir. And when I say true fir, again, I'm referring to any species in the genus Abies. The current Idaho record is down to Idaho County. It's 137 feet tall and 50 inches in diameter. So pretty chubby subalpine fir. It doesn't live as long as some other shade-tolerant species. Cedars can live to be thousands and thousands of years old, but it can live to be 250 years, which is typically longer than other species you see it grown with, notably lodgepole pine. It's again classified as a true fir. Simply means it's in the genus Abies. That's opposed to, say, Douglas fir, which isn't a true fir. It's in a completely different genus. Idaho's only other native true fir is grand fir, Abies grandis, which you can throw a rock and hit one anywhere in the Idaho Panhandle here. We have some other true firs that are nearby. Northeast Oregon has Abies concolor or white fir. Most folks are going to refer to all these species as white fir if they grew up around here locally, but subalpine fir is generally not as common as grand fir. And again, Douglas fir is not true fir. It's in a different genus, Pseudotsuga. The scientific name, Abies lasiocarpa, aka white fir, alpine fir, balsam fir. There's some local variants of it that you'll find, particularly for New Mexico and Arizona. Some of the nurserymen in the Bonner and Boundary counties are growing what they call corkbark fir, and you may have seen that in nurseries or whatnot. It's corkbark fir is simply a subalpine fir from Arizona and Mexico, that area where they have some subalpine fir that have a more whitish cast and needles and stuff, so a little more silvery looking than our subalpine fir up here. White fir is a term that people apply to all true firs in the area. That's true throughout the West, even though we have over a half dozen different true fir species. Alpine fir is a shorthand way. I say most people, to the extent they distinguish it from white fir, most people grew up around here will call it white alpine fir. Sometimes you hear it called balsam fir, and if you're familiar with balsam fir back in the Lake States, it is a real similar looking formed tree, so I can see where people would call it that as well. And again, most Westerners refer to any of their local native true firs as white fir, but actually the true white fir, Abies concolor, tends to grow much further south here. These maps show the range of white fir. Down in southern Oregon, is kind of the heart of it in the Northwest. There's a little bit of it scattered up here in Northeast Oregon, and they have found that there's been some genetic migration and hybridization between grand fir and white fir in Northeast Oregon, and even they find some white fir genes and characteristics in grand fir in north central, south central Idaho area, and McCall, and that part of the world. But technically, white fir is the official common name for Abies concolor, concolor being Latin fir without color. Identification, I think the first thing people notice is that spire shape, and it's a very dense kind of crowned tree. But these are subalpine fir up on top of Lookout Pass, and that spire shape is an adaptive advantage in helping those trees shed snow. You know, they'll keep it for a little while, but you know, you have big long branches, you're gonna get a lot of branches broken. So having a dense, compact crown is a good way of dealing with the snow loads. It's commonly found together with Engelmann spruce. At high elevations, the form of the two trees can be fairly similar. So I know when I'm going out looking for subalpine firs, I see some what I think is a really good subalpine fir, only to go up and shake hands with it and realize it's a spruce. So they can be pretty similar. If it's wide open grown, spruce tends to have a little longer branches, and obviously the finer morphological characteristics like fine needles, pointy buds, whatnot. And again, the spire-shaped crowns in both these species are an adaptation that helps them shed snow at high elevations. The needles are usually less than 1 inch long. Grand fir needles tend to be quite a bit longer than subalpine fir. And of course, subalpine fir probably, I think one thing most people catches their eye immediately is they tend to be masked on the upper side of the twigs, a little more three-dimensional in characteristics. And that's another reason that they can be often confused with spruce. But you notice that the ends of those needles are blunt rather than pointy like you have with subalpine fir or with a spruce. The other distinctive thing about their needles is or you have to be careful with that, because sometimes grand fir, as you get high elevation or high up in an individual tree, the needles tend to cup up a little bit more. But when you really get them side by side, it's much more distinctive on subalpine than it is on grand fir. These are 4 singly attached needled species that are often confusing for folks. And you look at cones and things like that, I always look at the buds to kind of help me distinguish these, and then the needles. So Douglas fir and spruce both have pointy buds, whereas the true firs all have blunt or rounded buds. Douglas fir in particular, and this obviously doesn't work in May or June when the growth is succulent yet on the tips, but Douglas fir has a very shiny, sharp pointed terminal bud. Spruce has a pointy bud. It's a little fuzzy, but it's more pointed than the true firs. And then here in grand fir, you see the needles a little more flat orientation, and on subalpine fir, they tend to be a little more three-dimensional on it, cupped up. Other things you can use to identify subalpine fir: bark on both young and old subalpine fir trees is generally smooth and gray. That's contrasted with grand fir bark on older trees. You tend to get a more kind of nondescript furrowed quality of the bark. So that smooth bark is, and that also distinguishes from spruce quite a bit too. You don't always see it, but both spruce and subalpine fir are very shade tolerant, so they keep the branches down pretty low in the tree, and you got to kind of dig in unless it's really tight stand to see that bark. But that's a really distinctive characteristic of subalpine fir, is that smooth bark. The cones, they have really kind of beautiful cones, purple blue, barrel-shaped cones, 2 to 4 inches long. Like other true firs, subalpine fir cones are concentrated up at the top of the tree, and like all subalpine firs, the cones point up instead of hanging down like they would with spruce or Douglas fir. The other thing is that it's rare that you will find a subalpine fir cone on the ground like you would with, pines or Douglas fir. When that cone is mature, the cone scales flake off and the seed is distributed by the wind. And then all you'll see is these kind of spikes, with a few seeds and cone scales remaining at the base of the spike once that cone is mature. If it isn't terribly windy, you may see piles of cone scales at the base of the tree from when that cone fell apart. These can also result from squirrels going up there and working over the cones to get seed that's in them as well. Wood products, it's not commonly harvested in Idaho. You know, when you talk to loggers about what kind of trees are cutting, it's rare you hear them talk about subalpine fir. But it does find its way to log trucks, certainly more than our other subalpine species, mountain hemlock or subalpine larch. So it is part of the mix. It can be used for dimensional lumber. You know, it has pretty similar characteristics to grand fir. Also used in pulp and paper products. But when it has stem decay, and in terms of pulp and paper, if it has some stem decay, which all the true fir species are prone to as they get older, it's really not much good for much else from a wood product standpoint than pulp and paper. I think one of the highest uses of it personally is Christmas trees. And, you know, many Idahoans, their most intimate knowledge of it comes from cutting it as a Christmas tree every December. It's a very popular Christmas tree. It's not one that's grown in plantations very often. It does take a while to get established. And, you know, if you're trying to grow Christmas trees, you're typically looking at a, 5 to 10 year period where you're growing the trees. And it just takes a while for subalpine fir to get started. Once it gets going, it can put on some decent height growth. But the wonderful thing about subalpine fir is you can get a nice, tall, full tree with a relatively small footprint. So this is down at the Harbor Center at the U of I in Coeur d'Alene. When we were located in there, I used to bring about a 20-footer in there. And, it fit the space really, really nicely. As opposed to grand fir as a Christmas tree, grand firs, unless you're really thoughtful about where you look for them, they can tend to be kind of a gangly tree with big wide gaps between the branches and everything. Subalpine fir tends to keep a little tighter foliage to it, so it's a more natural choice for a nice Christmas tree. They have outstanding keepability. I have gone out and cut subalpine fir in this time of the year, in late October, put them in a bucket in the north side of the house, put them up after Thanksgiving, kept them up through Epiphany, and still gone to that tree in the backyard in May and cut green branches from them. And that's what, spruce can make a nice looking Christmas tree too, but they tend to drop their needles quite a bit. You don't find that with subalpine fir too much. So wonderful keepability as a Christmas tree. It's early, as I mentioned earlier, it's early growth. It's typically a little too early for Christmas tree growers, or too slow for Christmas tree growers. Once it gets going, it can do well. However, it is commonly grown as a woody ornamental, and you're seeing it in a lot of landscapes all through our region right now. It's kind of interesting. There's I think this group has probably talked about phenology before, but phenology, is the science of when different life stages of plants and animals occur and how they may sync or not sync with each other. And one of those phenological stages for a tree is when they burst bud in the spring. And there was a forest researcher named, her name escapes me at this moment, but she studied the phenology of Douglas fir and when it breaks bud. And Douglas fir, if you're not familiar with it, has very tight seed transfer zones. It's only adapted to very specific latitudes and elevation of the seed, so you can't move it very far. And she found, and what she documented in her study was Douglas fir has a chilling requirement for the bud to break. And if that chilling requirement isn't met, that terminal bud doesn't break. And I have a half a dozen of these subalpine fir planted in my yard. And Dave Wattenberger used to be the extension agent in Bonners Ferry, and I used to commiserate about some of our subalpine fir and how the bud wouldn't break. And I think that's phenology. I think when you take high elevation seed source subalpine fir and plant it at low elevation, it doesn't get the chilling requirement met some years. So sometimes you get that terminal bud doesn't break, and you end up with these multiple leaders coming off up the top of it. anyway, it doesn't necessarily make it a bad thing. And you find a lot of multiple tops of subalpine fir out in the woods as well. But it is commonly grown as a woody ornamental, either just standard subalpine fir or some of the horticultural varieties from southern seed sources like corkbark fir. Its keepability and that three-dimensional quality of the foliage also make it really attractive to use in wreaths and other Christmas screens. You know, on the west side, noble fir, another true fir species, is often used in Christmas greens. I would say subalpine fir is our closest to that in terms of kind of the three-dimensional quality of the foliage, whereas grand fir needles tend to be a little flatter. Other benefits or value, maybe uses isn't quite the best word for this, but water and snow. Subalpine fir tends to grow in the places where we get our deepest snow, like up on top of Schweitzer. So subalpine fir is critical to water from snow, especially with changing climate. And there's a lot of discussions, you know, snow and snowpack is an important form of water storage in a sense, all over the Western United States. And there's been a lot of research. There's been a lot of research historically, but it's been intensified in recent years to see if forests can be thinned or manipulated in ways to increase the size and duration of snowpack. The idea, for example, of thinning high elevation forests in a honeycomb pattern so more snow reaches the ground. It doesn't evaporate from the trees, but you keep enough trees up there to kind of shade that snow so that snowpack lasts longer. And given where subalpine fir occurs, you know, you can think of it as an important species for water yield and forest hydrology as well. It occurs in a wide variety of cold, moist forest cover types. In full sun, subalpine fir will typically be outgrown by lodgepole, spruce, and similar associates, which are less shade tolerant than subalpine fir. But if you don't have a fire come in, subalpine fir can develop quite well in a shaded understory. And ultimately, if you don't have the fire come through, it'll take over the stand. Of course, high elevation forests where it grows tend to have fairly high frequency fire intervals, standard placing fires, you know, on a scale of every 80 to 100 years. So often when you have a forest, as you see composed in this photo, you know, you can see the ladder fuels in there. You get drought coming in, and it's going to go rapidly to more of a standard placing fire regime. And that's kind of the norm with these high elevation forests. You know, the really low elevation forests had more kind of the low intensity frequent fires that kind of left over shorter trees, like you see the ponderosa pine savannas. These higher elevation forests were more likely to have the big standard placing fire regimes. It is one of our least fire resistant conifers. Has thin ignitable bark, shallow roots. So if you have any heat all to the fire, it'll kill the tree to its roots. Very low branches, which make easy for a surface fire to get up into the crown. Often very dense stands, in part because of its shade tolerance. You can have more trees per acre, and highly flammable foliage, and lots of lichens if it's been there for a long time. As lichens dry out, you know, they're as flammable as anything else out there, and so they'll tend to burn up. It also has a relatively slow growth, and generally when I'm talking about growth, any forester, when they're talking about growth, is all talking about height growth. So, you know, they often grow less than a foot in height annually on all but the very best sites. So they're often slow to get started, as I mentioned earlier. We were talking about the nurseryman. But on good sites, a dominant subalpine fir seedling can grow 1 to 2 feet annually when it's in kind of sapling stage. So they're capable of doing some good growth once they really get some momentum going. But they're generally considered to be a slow-growing tree. They have some really funky growth near timberline. Subalpine fir is one of our few species that will reproduce vegetatively by layering. In other words, branches get laid down to the ground and roots sprout at the bottoms of those branches. So you get this effect of the tree spreading out in kind of a crumb hole pattern. Spruce also does this. Western red cedar is also capable of reproducing by layering. And here's one of those kind of Krumholtz forms where it's kind of almost what seems like a shrub, shrub form of the tree. So you'll find this kind of shrub spreading out and a few trees taken off. And you do get a lot of these kind of windswept kind of Krumholtz kind of form. In some cases, people have went up into high elevation areas and dug the full trees that have this kind of distinctive windswept form that made them part of, you know, Japanese gardens and things, because they're kind of come pre-bonsai'd in a sense. That obviously has to be done with some care so that you don't impact those sites and whatnot too much either. So you can get a lot of stunted vertical stems coming out from that mat-like shrub. Krumholtz is also just a fun word to say, and it either impress or bore your friends with. Regeneration, it produces good seed crops roughly every 3 years. It doesn't regenerate very competitively on warmer sites, which is why it's found at high elevation or in frost pockets. It doesn't necessarily need frosty areas to grow. It's just that in those areas, it has a competitive advantage over other species that would be growing there, which is why you see it taking over those real cold frosty areas. Shade tolerance makes it well suited if you want to regenerate it through partial cutting systems, you know, shelterwood selection, variable retention harvesting. You know, it's very, very suitable to those sorts of regeneration methods. It's not terribly wind firm. It partially due, it tends to grow in places like, you know, mountaintops or subalpine areas where the soils are fairly thin to begin with. So generally seed tree methods, you know, having widely spaced trees to seed in new subalpine fir are not particularly recommended for it. It may seed into burned areas very well, you know, because of the you know, rocky nature of and talus slopes and everything else you find in some of these places that subalpine fir grows. The fuels can be somewhat discontinuous. So areas where you do have these big standard placing fires, you still have some pockets where the fires don't get to, and they'll seed back in those areas generally pretty readily. If lodgepole or other shade intolerant species are mixed in, you know, they will dominate that site initially, even though everything may seed in at more or less the same time. It's rarely planted in Idaho reforestation efforts. For the most part, people are focused on other species like Engelmann spruce, and whatever subalpine fir is there, the people will welcome as a naturally seeded in recruitment to those areas where they're practicing forestry. Insects and diseases. Subalpine fir is impacted by the same insects and diseases as our other true firs. It's also a favorite target of a couple of others. So root diseases, subalpine fir can have issues with all the same root diseases that grand fir does. So anosum root disease, armillaria root disease, laminated root disease. They can kill the tree outright or make them more vulnerable to wind throw and insects. When you're thinking about root disease, the sorts of things you're looking at are thinning crowns, fading color, you know, if it looks kind of pale green or yellowish, slow height growth, which, I mean, subalpine fir is already pretty slow. So if it's a flat top, I guess that's maybe an indication of that. You'll see some pitching at the base of the tree of subalpine fir. Trees falling in all different directions, so they didn't obviously come down for a wind event. Those are all the sorts of things you're looking for with root disease. Subalpine fir is also vulnerable to Indian paint fungus, stem decay fungi, enters a tree through stubs of shade-killed branches and then stays dormant. And typically once a tree, you know, most trees, subalpine fir, grand fir, hemlock, they get infected with these fungi when they're relatively young trees. But as a tree gets 80 years old or older, the chemicals inside in the center of that tree start to wear down, and then the decay fungi become active because they're able to make a living on those carbohydrates. And it can become very extensive in older, you know, say 80-year-old plus subalpine fir. Defoliating insects are a big issue too. It's vulnerable to our two most important defoliating insects in terms of number of acres and trees they kill every year. Spruce budworm. Hemlock lucre is one that focuses on western hemlock and mountain hemlock, but it's really been hit in subalpine fir quite a bit the last 5 to 10 years. And hemlock lucre, again, is mostly known for hemlock, but here you see some defoliation of subalpine fir by that same caterpillar. And Douglas fir tussock moth. And boy, if you've been over Lookout Pass this summer, you may have noticed a bunch of grand fir and subalpine fir that look kind of brown frosted at the top, and that's because they don't have any needles at the top. So we have these Douglas fir tussock moth breakouts roughly about every 10 years. The last couple cycles we've had, they've been hitting some different areas than they've hit last 50 years, and people are kind of watching that with interest in case something strange is going on. But tussock moth is known. They have these 4 tussocks. They're kind of a beautiful caterpillar, but they can be very, very destructive to all true firs, including subalpine fir. Management trees often survive, one-time partial defoliation. You may get some top kill with them, so that's something to watch for. There are bark beetles that hit subalpine fir. Scolitis is one we have lots of issues with. Grand fir, often just referred to by its genus name, Scolitis. That will hit subalpine fir as well as grand fir. They tend to be attracted to stressed trees, so root disease and these bark beetle species go hand in hand on true firs often. Drought, anything that causes stress to the trees, is gonna make it more attractive to these various bark beetles. Identification: if the whole tree turns red in a period of 2-3 months, generally it's more likely a bark beetle than as a root disease. Root disease tends to be more of a slow cancerous fade over a period of years. And the way you identify any of the bark beetles is what kind of pattern do they create in the galleries underneath the bark. This is really where they're making their living, in that phloem between the bark and the wood. And with Scolitis, the main gallery is perpendicular to the grain. They lay eggs on either side of that, and then the eggs hatch, and then they feed with the grain going either direction from the main gallery. So pretty distinctive. And you see downed grand fir in the woods. A lot of times you can see these galleries in those engraved in those bowls years after the bark has fallen off, and they're quite distinctive. A bark beetle that kind of specializes in subalpine fir is the western balsam bark beetle, and it looks similar to mountain pine beetle a little bit, except it's a lot hairier. Has a fun name, Confucius, in the genus Dryocetes. Its primary host is subalpine fir. This bark beetle will typically build up in wind-thrown, stressed trees and logging slash, and it produces a distinctive star-shaped gallery in the bark, which is unlike any other bark beetle species we have, cross species. Attacks are usually above eye level, but you may see boring dust at the base of the tree. You'll also sometimes see some pitch streaming, similar to what you see with Doug fir beetles. Salvaging down trees, prompt slash treatment helps minimize issues associated with this bark beetle. But another one that everyone is keeping a constant eye on is an introduced species. The balsam woolly adelgid, or entomologists often refer to it by its initials, BWA. It's a non-native species that was introduced in the United States in the early 90s from Europe. It only hits a true firs, so you're not going to find it in pines or anything like that. But it is a problem with true firs all over North America, including balsam fir back east and some of our coastal fir species as well. It's a very, very small, adelgids and aphids are very small insects. Injects a substance, you see this long proboscis here, that causes abnormal growth in the bark and newly formed wood as it feeds in that phloem area. First thing you'll see in the woods, if you've been, hiking up in the Selkirks, whatnot, if you see subalpine fir that have this kind of Swellings around the buds and the branch nodes, that's the activity of this insect. So it's what's called gouting. So the branch tips tend to look a little clubby in appearance. You get the largest swellings in the fastest growing parts of the crown, which tends to be the tips and kind of medium up into the good full sun. Crown attacks court more often on poor sites. But gouted trees will decline slowly, but the growth and form are kind of mangled as they go. And this, how bad this is varies from site to site. You'll see there's a lot of sites where we don't really have much, but other sites are more severely impacted by it. You also get boll infestations with this insect, so you'll see them on the twigs and see the gouting. But if you see a subalpine fir that has these little white flecks all over it, that's quite likely this balsam woolly adelgid. And that they're a little bit like a scale insect in that regard, and that they have put a little covering over themselves to protect themselves. It's boll infestations are pretty clear, and these boll infestations are what's more likely to kill the tree. And when they do kill the tree, it does look a lot like scolitis up there. So if you go up there and you're not seeing these little white dots all over the tree, it's more likely bark beetle. But if we are seeing them, it could easily be. It's quite possible to have both. But if you're seeing a lot of those little white flecks all over the main stem, it could be this insect killing the tree. Haven't seen too much of this in the northern end of the Panhandle. Benoit and to some extent Clearwater counties have had subalpine fir killed by this insect. It's most abundant on the best sites. You know, they have 2 to 4 generations per year, depending on the locality and elevation. Balsam woolly adelgid, root disease, and foliators can all work together to kill these trees. They tend to be limited by cold weather, so the highest elevation subalpine fir won't have as much issues. You know, when I think of subalpine fir killing trees, I often think of those sites down by Clarkia and whatnot, where you see some subalpine fir being killed by it. There's multiple biocontrols been introduced from Europe. Mostly so far, they haven't been terribly successful. But all over the country, people are trying to find something that can knock this back a bit. So strategy in managing balsam woolly adelgid, select against susceptible or infested individuals, so favoring non-infested trees or species that don't get it. You know, so if you have subalpine larch or spruce, you know, they're not going to have issues with this insect. But it's also something we want to watch for in grand fir. On the coast, this insect has been active with grand fir, and that's, you know, one of the things that I've written some articles recently on global climate weirding. That, you know, when we think of climate change, a lot of times we tend to think of raw physics, you know, warmer, hotter, bigger precip events, whatnot. But I think some of the things that could be the most impactful would be things we can't even imagine. And some of these, both native and non-native insects, could function quite differently with even just a degree of temperature or two difference from year to year. So that, you know, is something I'm kind of watching for is this insect start to become an issue with grand fir as well as subalpine fir in Idaho. We have more subalpine fir now than ever. Again, fire exclusion probably means that we have more subalpine fir now than we had in many of our forests historically. Not as important as timber for other species, but subalpine fir has many other values and benefits. People tend to like it because it tends to grow into places where they like to recreate. You know, high elevation, the high country, where they're all people out elk hunting now or hiking or cross-country skiing in the winter. It's a very important species for snowpack management, and it has a lot of value for Christmas trees, floral greens, other things. And of course, all the wildlife species will use, you know, every part of the forest that's out there, including subalpine fir. It does have nice, dense branches to support a variety of different birds. Some references you can get more information about subalpine fir. The Silvix of North America is available online, and it'll go into great amount of detail. There's a number of dendrology textbooks that are out there that will give you information on this and other species. If you haven't gotten a copy of Steve Arno's book, Northwest Trees. I highly recommend it. Steve did a great job with that book. You know, he's a Forest Service researcher out of Missoula, and just has a really great background in the ecology of all these tree species, and it did a lot of work looking at the human culture associated with these trees too. So if you don't have that book, or if you're looking for a book to give us on for Christmas, that's a really great one on trees. Some publications on balsam woolly adelgid and balsam bark beetle are available online. And if you want any of these references, feel free to pop me an email and I can send you a copy of these, links to these as well. Okay, let me see if there's any questions in the chat here.
We have a number of questions, Chris, in the chat.
Okay.
Can you get to it?
I am trying to. There we go. Maybe I need to stop sharing screen.
I can, maybe you can see it now.
Yeah, I can.
Okay, good.
Can someone, post the book title? Northwest Trees. If you just Google Northwest Trees and Arno, the guy's name is Arno, it should pop up pretty quickly. It's a very, I'm sure it's a, I wouldn't be surprised if there used to be a bookstore downtown Sandpoint that I would be surprised if they didn't have it. Please leave our high elevation stands alone for wildlife. That's, boy, there's a lot to unwrap there. I mean, it's, you know, part of the thing with the word management conjures up a lot of different images for people. You know, we're already managing those stands by putting out fires. And so, you know, the key is if you value wildlife, some of those stands often need some treatment for different wildlife species. And of course, people can debate what kind of treatment, but I'm all about managing forests for wildlife as well as all our other values. Question of whether low elevation seed sources of Subalpine fir would have lower chilling requirements. I think that's a reasonable hypothesis. You know, and because it's, on the other hand, though, those part of the reason they're growing in those low elevation areas is because it's frostier. So the chilling requirements may not be as different from the high elevation ones as one might think. Does corkbark fir do well in North Idaho? I see a lot of them planted in landscapes, and they seem to be doing quite well. There have been a few cases where balsam woolly adelgid has gotten into subalpine fir planted in landscapes. You know, I back up the master gardeners now and then on some of these kind of questions, and occasionally that has come into the plant clinic, but I think maybe once or twice in the last 10 years. So it doesn't seem to be a huge problem. In fact, I almost wonder if the corkbark firs might be a little better adapted to the low elevation areas than our regular subalpine fir here, because they're longer, more simpatico growing seasons and stuff, I think, in terms of when they're timed to open bud. A lot of mortality along low elevation streams, the Selkirks and Colvilles. It may be natural. Is there a reason for this? Yeah, I mean, there's, you know, trees die in the woods. And so, you know, especially if there's, you know, most of our forests, including high elevation forests, are natural in the sense that they are composed of species that are native to our area. It's not like radiata pine grown in New Zealand or whatnot, but they're very unnatural in many cases in the sense of the species composition and density compared to what they would have been on average prior to European settlement. And then the biggest part of that is how we've been putting out fires or managing fires. And that's, and if you don't have the fires, then, you know, the system gets out of balance, and many times some of these, you know, root diseases, for example, have always been here. They're native fungi. They just never had the table set for them like they have now. And there's probably some of that in degree with subalpine fir. What elevations for subalpine fir? I'll just throw a number out in the panhandle. I start seeing subalpine fir around 4,000 feet, I think. I'd have to check some maps to confirm my instinct on that. But again, I mean, I've seen them just 5 miles up the river from Priest River, growing along Priest River there, and I'm guessing that's not more than 2,500 or 3,000 feet. So you can find, and it's kind of curious. You can find individual subalpine firs growing in places where there's nothing nearby at all. So it's surprising to me sometimes some of the places I'll see them turn up. But if you really want to see subalpine fir in its element, so to speak, you're generally going above 4,000 feet. How does subalpine fir stabilize snowpack? When we have a really good publication on forest water quality that goes in some depth on forests and how they relate to snow and snowpack. But essentially, when snow falls on forests, a lot of that snow, if it's a relatively dense forest, evaporates from the tops of the trees before it even gets to the ground. And if you want to regulate snow catchment a little bit, or at least attempt to increase it, if you allow more snow to reach the ground, so in other words, you thin the stand a little bit, that allows more snow to reach the ground. And then if you, but you want to keep sufficient number of trees there to shade that snow a little longer so it lasts. So that's strategy. Now there's a lot of things that factor into that in terms of slope position, what the snow is, what the size of the trees, but there's a lot of discussion of that in the forest hydrology community these days. And it looked like I got through most of the questions on the chat anyway.
Okay, Chris, did you want to use your poll about the woolly adelgid to find out what people have seen?
Yeah, I would be curious, because it is a good, you know, it's an invasive species. You know, we're trying to keep it in check. I am curious how many people have seen. I mean, one person one person talks about mortality along low elevation stream in the Selkirks and the Colville. That could easily be balsam woolly adelgid. But how many of you have seen subalpine fir with these kind of thickened twigs and stuff as you've been out there? I've been curious what's going on.
I just sent the poll out.
I see that.
That looks like the end of our activity on there. Oh, there's a couple more coming in. Still nobody's seen it.
Interesting.
Okay, here.
Well, that's good. That could be good news, or it could be that people are just so delighted to be out in the woods that they don't notice those things. You know, I often get lamentations from people who come to some of our extension programs, and they have insect and disease issues they hadn't noticed before, and now they can't go out in the woods without seeing some of these issues. And but next time you're out, especially high elevation or out in the woods, and you're around some subalpine fir, take a look at some of the twig ends and the branches and stuff. If you see that kind of thickened quality to the stem that seems unnatural.
Chris, another question came in about the gelid, about in the Usk area.
Mm-hmm.
Is it there?
It's pretty widespread through the region now, I think. I haven't seen too much of it up in the Priest Lake Basin yet. I have seen it up on Wolf Lodge Saddle area and that part of the world. I haven't seen it killing trees up here in the Panhandle yet, but as you get down towards south of St. Mary's and some of the higher elevation, it seems like I see it killing trees more along stream courses than I do high in the mountains. What I've seen high in the mountains has been more the twig swelling and not the boll infestations.
Right. The comment is that the forester's seen it on the trail logging project. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that could all. I mean, again, there's multiple things that it could also be those bark beetles that I mentioned as well. But what you're looking for, if you see in red trees, check the boll, and that the boll has got all those little white dots, and they persist on that tree for quite a while. It could easily have been killed by that balsamifolia delgid.
Are they winter killed?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd say they're winter killed. They don't have as many generations when you have really cold temperatures, and so they're temperature limited. So if you had some extreme cold weather, that would certainly probably knock them back a bit. But sometimes the too much gets made of cold weather killing insects. I've had a number of folks sometimes say that, oh, we got many bark beetles now because we haven't had these really cold winters. But most of our native insects, have been here, since the ice ages, if not before, and they've seen it all. So they're pretty well adapted to those cold. To really kill, for example, bark beetles, you need to get 30 below, forget the wind chill, for a significant period of time to really get to that. We don't often get that in most of our forests here.
Are there any other questions for Chris? We're a little after 11, so I don't see any more coming in. So we would, on behalf of the Native Plant Society, Chris, we really thank you for this presentation. We learned a lot about subalpine fir, and it's a beautiful blue sky day out there, and maybe get out and enjoy some of that. Wish everybody a good Saturday, and if there's nothing else, we'll call it a day.
Okay, it's always a pleasure. Sorry I'm not able to see you in person.
Thank you again, Chris. Bye, everyone.